sensual, his breath tickling her cheek.
I've been waiting so long for this.
Her insides quivered and her heart leapt to her throat. Me too. Lips pressed to hers, and for a moment she kept her eyes open, soaking in what little she could see. Shadows covered his strong, angular face. His hair seemed a little shorter, but maybe she just hadn't noticed that he'd gotten a haircut. She closed her eyes, running her hand up and down his arms, then through his cropped hair. His mouth was warm, pressed on hers, tender as his tongue stroked along the seam of her lips. Frissons of pleasure raced along her skin. She pressed closer, her tongue meeting his, touching, swirling, stroking. God, he was a good kisser. He nudged her onto her back, coming over her, one thigh pressed intimately between hers. "You're overdressed," she said with a teasing note in her tone when she felt the softness of his boxer briefs skim her thigh. But as she said it, he pressed his thick erection against the apex of her thighs and a soft whimper escaped her. He was so big, so warm, so hot.
I wasn't really prepared for this,
he murmured, nibbling at her lower lip. Did he mean he didn't have a condom? She was so hot for him, but even hyped up on vodka, she wasn't going to venture into it without protection. Good thing she'd tucked one into her purse, just in case. "Well, I'm here now." Gabrielle tugged at the elastic of his waistband, her fingertips skimming over the muscles of his abdomen and that V, the one that formed a near arrow pointing to a man's cock. Stroking the V, she wished she could turn on the lights and just examine his body for an hour or more. She'd never been with a guy who had the V, although she and her girlfriends extolled its sexual virtue, a must-have in every fantasy. John climbed slowly from the bed. He looked taller from where she lay, and thicker, much more muscular. She supposed not everyone looked the same naked as they did with their clothes on. His shadowy figure doffed his briefs and tossed them.
"Better?"
he said with a chuckle that stroked over every nerve in her body like a kiss. His voice was husky from sleep, so sensual, and yet something didn't seem right. "Much," she answered. He crawled back onto the bed until he loomed over her, his voice low.
"You're even beautiful in the dark, Gabrielle."
Brushing her fingertips up his muscled arms, she said, "Thank you. You're a lot more muscular than I thought." She immediately wanted to punch herself for saying something so dumb and unromantic. John only chuckled, sliding his body along hers so that she arched with the need for him to touch her more closely.
"I'm glad to pass your inspection."
He nuzzled at her neck, kissing and licking at the little dip on her throat where her pulse beat fast. "Oh," was all she could say. His hands were everywhere, touching the sides of her breasts, beneath, then cupping them fully. His thumbs brushed over her nipples and his mouth traveled from her neck to the tops of her breasts. She arched upward, wanting to feel the heat of his mouth on her nipple. He didn't waste time answering her body's plea, taking the puckered tip into his mouth. A cry burst from her lips at the sudden contact, even though she'd wanted it to happen. The sheer pleasure of his hot mouth on her took her by surprise. As he sucked at one nipple and then the other, he pressed his hot, hard length against the crux of her thighs. She spread them wider, her knees coming up to cradle his hips. Gabrielle massaged his back, growing bolder and moving down to cup his firm buttocks. She raised her hips as she pressed on his perfectly formed rear, wanting him to thrust inside her, to feel him filling her up.
"Not yet,"
he whispered, his teeth scraping over her earlobe before he captured her mouth for another searing kiss. Oh, my God. He was so good at this. She'd only been with a couple of other guys, and the whole experience with all of them combined didn't even come close to the pleasure she felt just from foreplay with John. His kiss was no longer tender, but carnal, demanding. Gabrielle strained to control herself, but she just couldn't. Whimpers and moans escaped her. She lifted her hips again and again just to